Deep below the Chicago River are the remains of the forgotten LaSalle Street Tunnel, a structure important to the city's history for many reasons, from being a marvel of engineering to the fact that it provided an escape route for thousands during the Great Fire. Its entrances have long since been paved over, and its condition and abandonment are not known to the public, yet its story should be. So join me as we discover the rise and fall of the forgotten LaSalle Street Tunnel. I'm your host Ryan Sokash, and you're watching It's History. In order to understand the LaSalle Street Tunnel, we need to talk a little bit about its predecessor, the Washington Tunnel. The Chicago River is a small river running through the city. Despite being relatively shallow and narrow, merchant, passenger, and even these days pleasure craft have utilized the waterway for centuries. Yet when the city was young, the river was a nuisance, dividing district, inhibiting unified growth, and causing dense traffic, both on the waterway and on the roads. As river commerce in the town grew, the need for crossings escalated to the point that a new style of drawbridges were created, allowing boats to pass from below and carriages to pass from above. I'm referring to, of course, the bascule bridge. We've already done a dedicated video on those, and you can catch up if you need by clicking this card. Otherwise, we're just going to kind of skim over the details for now. Even as these bridges appeared steadily across the city, the flow of ground traffic was so frequently halted by rushes in the river, rushes that would result in the bridge being lifted and blocking traffic, that at multiple points the city would be literally cut in half. And for that reason, it was clear that the bridges wouldn't be enough. There needed to be a new solution. And fortunately, a relatively shallow river provided its answer. On October the 28th, 1864, the City Council passed a new ordinance announcing their intention to tunnel under the river to ease foot and vehicular traffic during the busy season. Washington Street was chosen for the first tunnel, and after 3 years of planning, in May, ground was broken. 2 years later, on New Year's Day, the 1,605-foot-long tunnel was completed and inaugurated by a parade of horse carts to prove its security. The Washington Street Tunnel opened into Franklin Street on the east and Clinton Street on the west. The 10.5-foot entrances on both sides allowed easy access to horse and wagons. The gradient was gentle enough that wagons of up to 6,000 pounds could easily cross both sides, unlike some of the drawbridges. The tunnel was divided into tunnel chambers so pedestrians could cross through one tunnel and the wagons could use the other, limiting the potential for accidents, which turned out to be a good idea, given the lights for the tunnel, while decent, were 40 feet apart in the pedestrian lane and 50 feet apart in the wagon lane. The Washington Street Tunnel quickly proved its worth to the Chicago government, but it had problems in its construction that led to leaks and concerns about structural stability. While those issues weren't extreme enough to close it immediately, the city did realize it needed to build an alternative tunnel. While other locations, such as State or Adams Street, were considered, the planning board ultimately chose LaSalle as the new site. This tunnel would have to connect Randolph and Lake Street. Construction began by digging beneath Randolph Street while a cofferdam was placed over the river in November of 1869. It was only necessary to restore full river access by the summer of 1871. So even though I can't find a comprehensive document on how the cofferdam was built and used, newspaper descriptions imply parts of the dam could be opened or moved to allow free river access. Thankfully, the experience from the Washington Tunnel proved very beneficial to the LaSalle Street project. So much knowledge was gained through the previous construction that Chicago Tribune wrote in December of 1970, quote, "Little more will be thought of constructing a tunnel than building a house." With that in mind, work progressed steadily as the tunnel burrowed under the river from Randolph and was finished in the summer of 1869. The south side presented greater challenges as they tried to judge the soil conditions and had to partially remove the top floors of the nearby Steeles building when the diggers and architects determined their work would damage the building's foundation. Shortly after the floors were removed, they remarked, quote, "The wisdom of relieving the foundation of the superincumbent weight was shown by the crack visible in the lower part of the wall. Had the floor stayed, the entire building would likely have collapsed on itself, potentially without warning, and with hundreds of people inside or nearby. From there, the archway securing the roof and tunnel was tested thoroughly through the winter after the connection to Lake Street was made. The initial goal was to open the tunnel and river entirely in July of 1871, but to everyone's surprise, the cofferdam was safely removed ahead of schedule in August of 1870. For government work, this was amazingly ahead of schedule, and after some final touches, the tunnel was open to the public just 3 days behind schedule on the 4th of July, 1871. The tunnel, now 1,890 feet long, provided another easy access route between the north and south sides during the busy season. Now, this new tunnel had a major advantage over the Washington tunnel. While that tunnel was wide enough to allow for wagons coming in both directions, it was essentially one open chamber, whereas the LaSalle tunnel had a great safety feature. The tunnel had 2 chambers for wagons pulled by horses and draft animals, effectively making each one a one-way road. It also kept a smaller tunnel for pedestrian traffic. Hence, everyone was tucked away in their own safe little chamber, and these chambers were well lit by overhead gas lamps. However, it needs to be pointed out here that even with the improved design, it still leaked and collected water. When the tunnel opened in July of 1871, just like the Washington Tunnel, it was inaugurated by a caravan of city officials and prominent citizens who rode from the city courthouse to the Randolph Street entrance. The riders inspected the tunnel one final time, while reports described it as, quote, a model of completeness and tactful workmanship. It was drier, better lit, and better ventilated than the Washington Street Tunnel. The riders turned around at Kinzie Street and proceeded back under the opposite lane, ending their short but prompt inspection at the Briggs House Hotel, where the owners hosted their celebration. One speaker called the opening ceremony on Independence Day especially fitting, as it was, quote, the beginning of an era of independence from the bridge tenders, railway companies, and lazy lake captains. And just when everything was going so well, a disastrous, yet pivotal moment unfolded for the city. 3 months after opening, Chicago was engulfed by the Great Fire of 1871. As the fire rapidly spread across the South Division, the 3 tunnels became crowded by fleeing citizens escaping the blaze to the North Division. The tunnel's fortunate escape route was represented in several books and retellings of the fire, some fiction, others all too real. What is sure is that the tunnel, free of debris and not bound by bridge masters, offered many an escape route to survive one of the most disastrous events in American history. Let's take a moment to turn back quickly to that quote about accessibility of bridges and, quote, lazy lake captains. Not long after the tunnel was opened, an intense legal battle with the city over its construction was raised. The Northern Transportation Company of Ohio sued Chicago over damages and lost profit due to the tunnel's construction, interfering not just with river access, but also with a storehouse they operated from that was next to one of the construction sites. The company owned and operated 14 boats, with about 5 leaving downtown daily. However, their claim stated the cofferdam made it impossible for the river traffic to reach their company's wharf. By extension, they had to rent dock spaces that were accessible to other companies. If that wasn't enough to prove their claims, the storehouse was also closed, mostly because its openings on Water Street were blocked by construction equipment or churned up earth. Their complaint was genuine. However, Chicago did expect arguments like this to be made. After all, to build the tunnel safely, they had to effectively stop ships intended to arrive from the lake and travel down the Chicago River to the greater Mississippi. That didn't make the transit of cargo or people impossible, and the complaint admitted this. There were plenty of other dock spaces along Lake Michigan and the river that goods and passengers could transfer to. So the court's decision wasn't great for the company, with part of the jury believing, quote, the plaintiff took its lot subject to the city's right to make these necessary public improvements in the streets. The method of crossing the river at this point, whereas by ferry, a bridge, or a tunnel, was one to be determined by the city authorities. And when they had determined to effect the crossing by a tunnel, they had the right to use and occupy so much of the street as was necessary to construct the tunnel, using due skill and care and dispatch always in doing it, so as not unnecessarily to interfere with private property. The transportation company told the judge to make the jury reconsider, but he quickly refused. While disruptive to river traffic, he and the jury thought the tunnel was a justifiable civil construction project, and that the disturbance to this company in particular was not made in malice. As Chicago's general infrastructure improved close to the end of the 19th century, streetcars and trams became more common for civil transport, disrupting the traditional horses and wagons along the way. The ever-increasing size of the city made the continued reliance on draft animals impractical, as streets became choked and almost impassable due to stopped carriages lining and protruding into the streets as their contents were being loaded or removed. On LaSalle Street, a plan was proposed to aim a tram line from the junction with Monroe to Randolph Street, with the tunnel now closed to wagons and opened only to trolleys. The traffic flow did improve noticeably, but this wouldn't be the only change the tunnel needed to make. In September 1901, the Secretary for War informed Chicago that Congress mandated tunnels be buried deeper to allow for larger vessels to pass over them. The draft of the river with the tunnels and nautical sediment was around 16 feet, whereas Congress demanded it be raised to 22 feet. So across the city, 3 tunnels, including the LaSalle, needed to be rebuilt and dug even further underwater. This was highlighted by the LaSalle Tunnel being flooded by 1906 as the final preparations were made, and the public was starting to realize that these old stone tunnels just weren't suitable. The new LaSalle Street Tunnel was a long steel construction, crafted almost like a double-barrel shotgun. The third lane for pedestrians was completely removed, while the 2 new steel tunnels would house trolleys. The piping was constructed and erected in a dry dock to remove the need for another cofferdam in a much busier river, and was shielded in layers of concrete. The work stretched out longer than the original tunnel's construction and was only completed in 1912. Allowing streetcars to once again pass under the river in what was a vital connection of the city's wards. After spending $1,250,000 as well as 2 hard years of labor, the last major change the tunnel would see was finished. Streetcars operated in the tunnels for a few more decades, but ultimately, the times had changed. What started as a city of horses and sailboats turned into a city of trucks and cars. The auto industry was booming, and even after the Great Depression, personal vehicles were still seen as the future of transit. Hence, in 1939, federal judge James Wilkerson approved a city motion to close the tunnel in exchange for the Dearborn-Logan subway route. The entrances were barricaded for safety, and for all practical purposes, were completely forgotten. In 1952, with the soldiers' home and cash from the Marshall Plan flowing into American factories, the decision and planning to close the tunnel was finally made. The tunnel was sealed altogether that year, and the north entrance was completely covered with concrete and then regular traffic lanes. The lifespan of the LaSalle Tunnel is a unique representation of the city's urban planning. When the tunnel was first proposed, the idea of using draft animals to pull goods and cargo across the city, even if it meant going under the river, was completely rational. But then, the city grew. It got busier. Engines got better. The wagons were replaced with tram lines, and eventually, the pedestrian lanes were removed. Even though it was only open for a matter of decades, it still shows us how the city changed and how the world has changed with it. And if you ask me, that's a pretty good story. So we'll leave it there for today, but I hope you'll consider supporting the channel by clicking join and subscribe. Otherwise, until next time, I'm Ryan Sokash, signing off.